You know the moment. Someone goes quiet right when you needed them, or you catch a version of a story that doesn't match what they told you last month, and something in your chest just closes. And a sentence forms, fully shaped, like it was always true. No one is loyal, not really. Everyone has a price. You've probably said some version of that to yourself, and it felt less like a feeling and more like a discovery. In a moment, I'll show you the exact psychological switch Carl Jung identified, the one that explains why that sentence forms so easily and why it usually isn't really about the person who just let you down. And by the end, I want to show you what that verdict has been quietly protecting you from this whole time, and what happens the instant you turn that same line back on yourself instead of the crowd. But first, let's actually sit with the claim itself, because the people who hold it aren't fools. Let's take the claim seriously, because most people who hold it aren't fools. Loyalty, they say, is theater. Everyone has a price, a breaking point, a moment where self-interest wins and the mask drops. Give it enough time, enough pressure, enough temptation, and the person who swore they'd never leave will leave. It isn't cynicism, they'll tell you. It's just pattern recognition. And maybe it is. But notice something before we go further. This verdict was drawn as a line pointing outward, straight at the crowd, naming them as untrustworthy. Now, watch that same line curve. Watch it come back toward the hand that drew it. Because before we ask whether the world is disloyal, we should ask who built the frame that keeps finding it so. Jung noticed something simple and unsettling about what we push down. It doesn't disappear. It resurfaces, just displaced onto a different target. A man, polite and patient all day at work, comes home and turns his temper loose on his wife, not because she caused it, but because she's safe to aim it at. And there's a second version, quieter. People who strain toward moral perfection, who insist they act only from ideals, end up taking their private revenge in small, deniable cruelties. A cutting joke, a withheld kindness, never registering it as malice because it can't be, not in someone so principled. So here's the hypothesis, not yet the verdict. What if no one is loyal is not an observation about them, but a displacement, the residue of a suspicion you can't locate in yourself, landing safely on everyone else instead? But let's not rush to dismiss the gut. Sometimes it's not projection at all, it's accuracy. Your subconscious tracks patterns you can't consciously name. We are creatures of habit, wired to expect familiarity in the people we know. And when that familiarity breaks, a tone shifts, a story doesn't line up, a promise gets quietly rewritten. Something in you fires a warning before your conscious mind catches up. That isn't paranoia, that's pattern recognition doing its job. If someone reads a friend's sudden coldness correctly, if they sense betrayal before it's confirmed, that's not a wound talking, that's awareness, earned through experience, and it deserves to be respected, not therapized away. So here's the hinge. Noticing one person's inconsistency is a signal. Concluding that no one, anywhere, is capable of loyalty, that's not a signal anymore. That's a sentence passed in advance before the evidence walks in the room. A signal stays tethered to a specific person, a specific moment, a specific reason. A verdict detaches from all of that and becomes a belief about human nature itself, applied to strangers you haven't met yet. And that's the exact place suspicion stops tracking the world and starts tracking you. The gut that says something is wrong with this one person is doing its job. The mind that says, therefore, nothing is ever right with anyone, has quietly stopped gathering evidence and started protecting something. So what does that fixed verdict actually protect? Think about what it spares you from. If no one is loyal, you never have to risk being disappointed by someone you actually let close. You never have to hand someone real trust and watch what they do with it. And most conveniently, you never have to sit with the harder question, whether you yourself have ever been the one who wasn't loyal. Jung had a warning about this kind of avoidance. He said a person can feel free of a conflict by simply refusing to look at it consciously, but it doesn't vanish. It lies invisible at their feet, and they trip over it at every step, without ever recognizing the shape of what keeps tripping them. I want to pause here and ask you something honestly. When you think back to the moment you decided people generally can't be trusted, was there a specific person underneath that decision? A specific disappointment you never quite named as your own? I'm genuinely curious where that verdict came from for you, and where you land on this now. Tell me in the comments, because I think most of us are carrying a more specific story than the general one we tell. Now let's separate two things that look identical from the outside. Seneca drew a hard line between friendship sought for advantage and friendship sought for itself. He said the one who becomes your friend because it pays will also leave when it stops paying. That kind of bond was never really about you. Real friendship, he said, exists so you'd have someone to die for if it came to that. Someone whose ruin you'd stake your own life against. That's not naivety, it's the opposite of transactional. And here's the twist. The wise, self-sufficient person and the guarded cynic can look the same from a distance. Both slow to bond, both hard to buy. But one is armored against ever needing anyone. The other simply isn't for sale. Only one of them can still recognize loyalty when it actually arrives. Epictetus drew the distinction that finally resolves this. Being alone, he said, is not the same as being solitary in the helpless sense. A man surrounded by crowds can be desperately solitary, and a man entirely by himself can be nothing of the kind, because he's learned to be sufficient for himself, his own companion, before anyone else arrives. That's the position this whole video has been circling, not no one is loyal, not everyone is loyal. Something quieter. I don't need to decide that in advance because I'm not waiting on anyone's answer to know who I am. And from that place, real loyalty, when it shows up, doesn't look like a threat to test. It just looks like what it is. So the line that opened this video, pointing out at the crowd, accusing the world of never being loyal enough, it was never really about the crowd. Watch it curve back one last time, settling on the hand that drew it, not in defeat, but in something closer to relief. The question was never, who can I trust? It was, what have I refused to trust in myself? And once that line closes, the world outside stops owing you an answer it was never actually responsible for. What would it look like for you to draw that same line back toward yourself? Not to prove you're wrong about people, but just to see what's actually there. I'd like to know what you find.